Welcome to the Dr. Berkson's Best Health Radio Show, and I am so pleased to have on this show someone who has had one of the longest medical-oriented and hosted health shows in the United States, an old friend, not that he's an old person, although we're all, if we're living well, living longer. And we have on the show Dr. Ron Hoffman, and we're going to hit head on a number of questions that have really been burning in my craw lately. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about Ron before I bring him on. Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Ronald Hoffman, is one of New York's pioneering integrative medicine practitioners. He got his medical degree from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and he's been practicing for 34 years. In fact, before the show, we were just kind of chatting about how it was being older and having been in the business for a long time. He has a very amazing radio show that I share on my own tribe on Facebook because it is so based in science, and he asks intelligent questions. He takes studies and said he might go through the literature and say that the result and conclusion of the study is inaccurate, and this is why. And thus, the name of his radio show is Intelligent Medicine. And that's, what I love on the show, agile thinkers. So we have a really agile thinker today. And by the way, Intelligent Medicine is the longest-running physician-hosted health program on the air. He also is host of the Intelligent Medicine podcast series, where he, like myself, interviews luminaries, and he's interviewed me a number of times, I think 6, 7, 8 times over the last so many years, in the field of complementary and alternative medicine. And besides that, if that weren't enough, he's the author of numerous books, and he lectures frequently to everybody, colleagues of mine, as well as the public. And let me tell you what we're going to hit on the show today, just some of the topics. And I'm sure as we get into the dialogue, and you're in on this dialogue with us, we're going to go to different places. But we're going to talk about supplements. Are they good or bad? Because articles are coming out dissing them as they do. And I know that Dr. Ron has been bringing this up on his videos. We're going to talk about how drug companies make up diseases to sell you more drugs. This is called pathologizing every daily life experiences, or disease mongering. And we're even going to talk about factors like, when is calcium good or bad, and does the vitamin D craze liberate excessive amounts of calcium and put you at risk? So we're going to talk about real things and get into the nitty-gritty. So Ron, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Devaki. And I might say that we're a mutual admiration society. I admired your work for a really long time, and you're always a terrific guest. And this time I get to sit back and get interviewed by you. So I look forward to it.
So I really like this. Is the first time I've interviewed you. You've mainly done the opposite. So now it's like being on the opposite side of the desk. So you have published on Facebook and online recently a number of articles that said that supplements don't work or they're bad. And you've been addressing that head on. So will you chat with us about that? Because the people that read these articles get scared and nervous, and they don't know what to think. Help us think.
Well, it really is the height of absurdity to take an entire category of substances and, with a blanket statement, say that they are, quote, worthless or even worse, harmful. So it really suggests that there's not science going on here, that there really is an agenda. And this has happened again and again over the past few years. We've had to sort of sound the alarm and go to battle stations and defend ourselves from inaccurate attacks. And they come in two forms. They come in articles in medical journals that are highly biased, that skew the results of studies, by cherry-picking studies, by picking studies that show that vitamins either don't work as effectively as we thought, or in some cases could be harmful. But it's also journalistic malpractice, because many of the studies are misrepresented with clickbait headlines like, Americans are wasting their money on supplements. Drawing that kind of conclusion, a little bit like saying on the basis of certain drugs which have been withdrawn from the marketplace because of safety concerns and because they've killed thousands of people, that we should never take medication ever. And that's a little bit of an extreme position. I don't even espouse that position. I think medication has a place. It's just that we're over-medicalized. But you can't take a broad brush and say that supplements don't work. We really have to take it on an individual basis. And it's true that, maybe in certain cases, supplements that we once thought worked well don't work as well as we thought. Sometimes they need to be used more judiciously than we thought.
What case might that be? What are you thinking of when you're saying
Well, as
that?
you mentioned earlier, there are some concerns about calcium. For example, I mean, there was a calcium craze. I think you remember it in the 80s. Everybody was swallowing massive amounts of Tums because we thought it was going to fortify our bones. This is a result of something that you also referred to, which is disease mongering, which is taking a natural condition, which is the natural reduction in bone density that people experience as they get older, particularly women, and creating an entire industry around it, an industry where we scan people at great expense and where we prescribe medications that cost billions of dollars, with, in some cases, side effects that are pretty considerable on the basis of very little evidence. But calcium, look, let's put it this way. Science is very nuanced, and it by no means is calcium harmful. There's just some questions as to whether megadosing with calcium could potentially cause some of the calcium to get deposited in our arteries, and that isn't even a firm scientific conclusion. It's a little bit like the global warming controversy or climate change controversy. I mean, you never can say that a big issue like supplements is, quote, settled science. You really can't put it in the drawer, close the drawer, and throw away the key.
When I published Safe Hormone Smart Women, that came out in 2010, so I was writing it in the middle, like 2004, 5, 6, and 7. It took a few years to write that. And there was a lot of data that showed that if women get a small amount of calcium, mostly from their food and maybe 200 milligrams from their supplements, it was contributory to the other minerals that help hold the integrity of the bony matrix. But if you get more than 5, 6, 700 milligrams over what you need, you have an increased risk of fracture. But if you go to a gynecologist or a family practice doc today who doesn't practice nutrition and you have osteopenia or osteoporosis, they're still going to be recommending 1,200, if not more, milligrams of calcium a day, which is old, bad.
Right. And that's because they're sort of one-note Charlies when it comes to nutrition for osteoporosis. They think about calcium, they think about vitamin D, but they don't think of all the other cofactors that go into the mix. I mean, bone is living tissue, and it's not just a repository for calcium like the White Cliffs of Dover, made of chalk, calcium carbonate. That's not what our bones are made of. So it stands to reason that just loading ourselves with calcium isn't necessarily going to enhance our bone density. But if you actually follow the trail and look at some of the research that suggests that calcium at high levels is harmful, you'll see that it can be attributed to a guy in New Zealand. He's an expert, so he says, on calcium side effects. And he's kind of has a bone to pick, if you excuse the pun, with the use of calcium in general and in the use of supplements in general. So sometimes if you actually look up the guys who read some of the studies, they proceed from an anti-supplement bias. So in my mind, it remains a controversy. And I wish, you and I wish we could give people definitive answers, but the science changes. Studies keep coming in. One says yes, one says no. So we can't be too definitive even about that issue.
I love talking to you in Manhattan because you hear the background, regular Manhattan noises. When you're in Manhattan, that's a typical ambient background.
Realism.
It's not when you're in Austin, Texas.
Right. We're here very close to what's called Bedpan Alley, which is a row of hospitals along First Avenue. And I trained at one which was kind of at the lower extremity of Bedpan Alley, the Manhattan VA. But then you have Manhattan VA, Bellevue, you have NYU, you have what's now Columbia Cornell, and Mount Sinai, and they're all in line on the Upper East Side. All the real estate is owned by the hospitals.
Well, I worked for about 6 years in Tulsa with a double board certified internist, and he would specialize in remineralizing women in their 80s and 90s who had osteoporosis, and he had an office in-house hand DEXA scan. So he would put them on a protocol. He would get them off all calcium. He would put them on multiple minerals that have a lot to do with the integrity of the bony matrix. He would improve their digestion, because digestion is essential, because that's a big part of bone loss as you age. You're not absorbing the minerals that support your bones. And then he would have women come in once a month and stick their hand in this hand DEXA scan to make sure that they were increasing just a very minuscule amount to know that that protocol was working. And usually within 2-3 years, based on pre and post whole body DEXA of the spine and the hip, they would go back to normal bone density.
And what's nice about the hand density, is that you're not exposing your whole body to the radiation. So I really don't like women to go in for spinal and hip scans, the regular DEXA, because, I mean, maybe every couple of years, but then there's an awful lot of time where there's uncertainty. So I think that's kind of an interesting idea, looking at the hand. I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, and it was a really inexpensive, easy thing to do. And I didn't know that there was, when you ask your docs if there's radiation from those DEXA scans, they tell you no.
Well, of course there is, yeah. And it's a relatively low dose, but, it's not something that you want to add to your daily regimen of ambient electromagnetic radiation. It's we all have sort of a cup runneth over kind of situation when it comes to the amount of radiation that we can be exposed to safely. And most of us get too much radiation vis-a-vis, even plane flights. We get a lot of imaging studies. And then we start scanning people. We do heart scans and we do, CT scans of the brain and, all that stuff. And that adds up. And it's actually been estimated that it somewhat increases one's risk for cancer over the span of a lifetime.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense a lot. So since we're saying that the body loves calcium in a Goldilocks just right level, it doesn't like too little and it doesn't like too much, and usually giving large dosages like we used to do and some docs still do, it's too much. We do know that one of the actions of vitamin D, besides its ever-growing, enlarging job description, is it enhances the body's ability to absorb calcium. So now people are trying to get their vitamin D levels to 70. I took a course with Dr. Sheely. He was recommending over 100. Yet that's really enhancing the absorption of calcium. And we're now seeing a higher and higher risk of primary hyperparathyroidism, which is the parathyroid gone a little goofy, and we're tending to lay calcium down in all the wrong places. So what's your thought on what's the right amount of vitamin D in relation to calcium, and how do we keep those levels optimal?
Well, I'm still a big fan of vitamin D, although there's some people who are waving the caution flag on our vitamin D infatuation. I still think it's important. I think it's particularly important with people who have conditions. I use it really medicinally in individuals with autoimmunity, with MS, for example, with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. For the average person, I think it suffices to take anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 international units of vitamin D. That's what I take personally. And then in the summer, I back off slightly because I know I'm getting some vitamin D through sunlight. Look, I really try to take sort of a paleo approach to a lot of these nutrients. We humans were designed to walk around basically without clothes near the equator. And we've had, maybe a few thousand years to adapt to living in foggy environments at northern latitudes. You hear the sirens again. Really, vitamin D can be very therapeutic against a lot of conditions. I think to lockstep everyone and say, you need to take 10,000 or 15,000 international units of vitamin D, I think we're going to run into some problems eventually.
So vitamin D is so helpful. We do know that if you have more optimal levels of vitamin D, you have less premature death. I mean, it's anti-inflammatory. It helps your immune system see breast cancer cells. But then there is the caveat that it does enhance absorption of calcium. And some people are more prone to deposition of excess calcium than others. And so once again, you really need to work with somebody that knows what they're doing.
And then there's some thought that vitamin K may mitigate the effects of high doses of vitamin D. And, vitamin K is such a big player. I just heard a lecture from Dr. Schergers here in New York. He's a guy from the Netherlands. It's interesting. The country that these researchers come from sometimes, shall we say, influences their research, and they're big eaters of cheese. They're aged cheese in the Netherlands, and of course, aged cheese is very rich in vitamin K2. And the other source come from Japan, which is natto. But it turns out vitamin K2 is very protective against atherosclerosis. And he's doing some fascinating research showing that vitamin K may be sort of a crossing guard for calcium. It sends calcium to all the right places and keeps it away from the wrong places, enhancing bone but protecting the arteries.
So tell me, what is the reason that some people that are very dairy intolerant can handle hard cheeses much better? They'll often come in and say, I can handle the hard cheeses, but I can't do soft cheeses or dairy or ice cream or things like that. What's the reason for that?
I think it's probably the lactose composition. Hard cheeses are actually relatively low in lactose. There's also some new buzz on alpha milk, milk that has alpha lactoglobulin as opposed to beta lactoglobulin. And maybe that some of these natural cheeses, these artisanal cheeses, are richer in the original protein.
Wait. What's an artisanal cheese?
Some of the fancy cheeses that are made in Europe.
That's a fancy name.
Yeah, I'm not talking, processed, American cheese, Kraft slices or something like that. That would be an example of something that's, not very akin to something that comes out of a cow's udder.
Right. It's utter than that.
Utter disaster, I would say. We're on a roll here, I can see.
So one of the things that's an utter disaster is how much the drug companies are making up diseases to sell drugs. The United States is the largest single pharmaceutical market in the world. In 2017, we generated more than $450 billion of revenue. In contrast to all of Europe, their drugs only generated $214 billion of revenue. No country purchases as many drugs. Now, we know drugs rinse out nutrients, and very rarely are you given a prescription and told what nutrients to take. But, the Mayo Clinic says that nearly 70% of Americans take at least one prescription drugs. Now, about that same amount of Americans are now starting to take nutraceuticals, but women come in saying I have dysphoric disease, which, they were just trying to come up with new ways to use meds, so they just made premenstrual syndrome into dysphoria. So can you talk a little bit about disease mongering? Because I know you've been writing about it recently, and it makes the American public scared and wanting to buy more drugs.
It's really sheer medical economics because there's only a finite number of people to get sick. And although, disease is rampant, how do you get people on board who don't have a major health problem? You sell them medications that address pre-problems, such as high LDL cholesterol. Well, we know that high LDL cholesterol predisposes some people to cardiovascular disease, but that's rather the exception than the rule. We look at conditions like shyness. That little librarian who used to sit in the corner and not talk a lot to people, maybe was a little introverted. Now she's a candidate for an SSRI medication because there's lots of papers showing that shyness, or social phobia as it's now called, that sounds more scary, can be overcome with a lifetime prescription of a medication. We deal with GERD. Okay, well, GERD I consider a lifestyle problem. It's like if your esophagus is bothering you, pay attention to what you're eating. And it may be a signal from your body that you're, going to excess, and that's good because then you might lose some weight and stop eating junk. But instead, we have medications that allow you to put the feed bag on and not worry about any acidity from your stomach. That's what I mean by disease mongering, and it's a big problem because things are profit driven in America. Not that they aren't in certain countries, but especially here, and we have direct to consumer advertising that gets people interested in medications. Doctors don't even want to prescribe them, but they want to please their patients. They have jobs that are dependent on patient approval. And so it's ask your health professional. It's no longer ask your doctor, by the way. It's ask your health professional because mostly these days, primary care, you're going to be seeing PAs or nurse practitioners or maybe in the future a robot. And, you'll ask them for that medication that you just saw on TV.
It's really something, a a drug company can't advertise a drug before it's on the market. But there's no legislation or regulation that says that it can't start advertising and making up a disease.
There were what are called awareness campaigns. And it's very interesting. It sounds really great. It's sort of greenwashing for the pharmaceutical companies. They're saying, well, let's increase awareness about the problem of urinary frequency, or OAB, overactive bladder. Well, you get older, and sometimes you want to go to the bathroom more. That's kind of natural. It's a natural factor of being human.
Although hormones and magnesium and exercise and Kegels and all that
absolutely
would work even better than those
no question.
meds.
I'm not dismissing it as a complaint, but there are natural ways to deal with it. But to some extent, there's some inevitability to it. But the drug companies are increasing awareness of this, that they pathologize this, and then they get people to take on medications that, oh, by the way, tend to be brain robbers. These are anticholinergic medications. Acetylcholine is an essential neurotransmitter for the brain. So you pee less frequently, but then all of a sudden, inexplicably, you're losing it. You're experiencing cognitive decline. Next thing you know, you're being diagnosed as having Alzheimer's. Well, actually, it's the medication.
People don't realize that allergy meds have been known for years. The longer you're on allergy meds, for every 3 years you're on allergy meds, you increase your risk of getting cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease by a significant percentage. This has been in the data for years. It's crazy, but no one tells you that when they hand you a script for allergy medication. And even scarier is that, you take these sleep medications, and it turns out that their main ingredient are allergy meds. Powerful antihistamines that have a sedating effect. So if you take Tylenol PM or Advil PM, what have you, Sominex, all these medications have anticholinergic effects. So they may, in addition to making you feel hungover in the morning, they can dull your brain. There's so many people that come in with early signs of brain issues, and one of the main things is getting them off of drugs that are actually a big part of the cause. And then there's an herb that has a lot of rebooting of the cholinergic pathway, and I tend to have people make smoothies or different kinds of things with this herb. It's nettles.
Nettles. Interesting. Okay.
Nettles is one of the highest natural sources of acetylcholine, and it's very brain lubricating. It's quite incredible.
Okay.
So I use, try and merge food and herbs and so forth. But, with the statin thing, women come in and they have just a little bit of elevated cholesterol, and their docs are telling them that they need to go on statins, when if you really sit down and read the literature, women who are 65 and older that have a little bit higher cholesterol levels live longer, have less dementia. If they get an infection, they have less mortality rate or severe morbidity from the infection. Cholesterol is protective in a lot of groups, but we have just medicalized the way that we look at it based on middle-aged 40-year-old men that are at risk of heart attack.
It's like a paint-by-numbers approach. And I think, unfortunately, doctors are taught not to think like the scientists that they aspired to be. They're taught to be basically to adhere to a rule book. And the rule book states that for an LDL above a certain level, you have to prescribe a statin medication. And that's also reinforced by our tort system. If, God forbid, some harm should come to someone who you didn't put on a statin, and hey, stuff happens, mayhem happens, and somebody gets a stroke or a heart attack, you might be liable. So there's a CYA element sometimes in prescribing medication, even if doctors may not prescribe it to family members. They themselves recognize that there may be harmful effects.
The litigious component of all of this is so maddening because the patient loses out. And the drug companies they have the right for 10 to 15 years before a drug is launched to be creating this awareness and this thought that you should ask your physician. And then children are sitting in front of the TV getting the message that drugs for every single activity of life are normal. And we're ending up with a very ill society. We have so much suicide that's happened recently in the news. 25 states have a 30% increased risk of suicide. We're not healthy with all of the litigious awareness and the meds that we have in the largest pharmaceutical industry in the world. So what are your thoughts? Really today, people are coming in reeling. And young kids today, we're seeing in our young teenage girls, we're seeing epidemics of polycystic ovarian syndrome, autonomic dystonia, which is POTS disorder. We're seeing sicker and sicker kids 7, 8, and 9 that have early cognitive issues and high blood pressure issues. I know that your show, that your whole desire is a mission to inform people, but what do you think? Where's the disconnect of all the information that shows like you are doing with a sicker and sicker public? How do we help even more?
Well, I think it speaks to a great divide that we see in this country. I mean, there's a big divide in terms of income. It seems the income disparity in this country is increasing. But there's also a great health divide. I think more and more people are health conscious, because when I was a kid, it was an anomaly to see people jogging. Maybe you'd see some sports team, jog by your house, in uniform from the local college. But, middle-aged adults, no. But when I go back home to my hometown, there's a constant stream of 70-somethings running down the median strip near my house. And so there really is a health revolution occurring. But at the other end of the spectrum, more and more people are obese, more and more people are over-medicated, more and more people are experiencing the effects of pollution, and more and more people are experiencing the adverse effects of medication, because the very medications that we take tend to set us up more for illness. So there's a great divide. Programs like yours and programs like mine, to some extent, we're preaching to the choir. It's reinforcing the health resolve of people. Maybe we can bring a few more people into our fold. But I think the real tipping point may occur when our health system crashes and burns. And I don't want to seem apocalyptic here, but there really will come a point where we won't be able to afford the kind of health expenditures that we've been running, and people are going to have to look for alternatives.
Right before we started the show, we were talking that you just got your Medicare.
Yes.
You just went on that, yes. And what's really crazy is that Medicare only covers a certain percent of things, and that's shrinking. And what the bills that are now in Congress are, they're saying that they're going to cut Medicare by $8 billion. So Medicare covers a shrinking amount of things, and the supplementals you could buy cover 20% of the 80% Medicare doesn't cover. But there's no insurance policies that a senior citizen can purchase of it that's not covered by Medicare. You can't go to an insurance agent and say, I'm willing to pay whatever so that I can cover my A, so I don't go into bankruptcy. Right. And so we are setting up a whole senior demographic that's much more at risk of bankruptcy.
And poverty.
And so and poverty. So we, no matter, even if you're anybody but Bill Gates, it's just set up like that. So we now must embrace natural answers. That I think that's going to be the saving grace.
It's interesting. And just an example of this is I had a patient in recently who experienced a spinal fracture. She was lifting a table and all of a sudden had tremendous pain in her back, and she'd never gotten tested for osteoporosis, and she did have a painful spinal fracture. So she was told to go on a medication called Forteo. Now, she asked me for a second opinion, and I said, well, I think there are natural ways to deal with this, but you already had a spinal fracture. So in an abundance of caution, now that you're on Medicare, I think you should take the medication because it's probably covered. And she said, oh, no. She said, that medication is going to cost me $10,000 per year, and I have to take it for 2 years. And I said, that's really crazy. Well, what's that about? And she said, well, that's the copay. They only pay for a very small fraction of the medication. And this is essential medication for this person. So I really got schooled in medical economics there, because I just sit there with a prescription pad and say, okay, take this, take that, oblivious to the consequences, because doctors don't know. They just prescribe away, and they have no idea what the consequences are to patients' pocketbooks.
I just had an acute dental emergency, and we thought it was casing from popcorn caught inside my gum, but when he moved back the gum, it turned out to be a huge cyst that had been growing in my nerves and in my jawbone. And Medicare doesn't cover the biopsy, the procedure, anything.
Well, that's my grandfather. When I told my grandfather that I was going to medical school, I thought he'd be very proud of me and say, that's wonderful. But he was an old Eastern European guy, and he said, doctor, he said, you should become a dentist. And he was very smart. He was a good businessman. And he's probably right.
Well, one of the other things I've been wanting to talk to you about, since we must embrace natural answers if we want to get ourselves well when bad things come down the pike, and in everybody's life, being in a human body, bad things are most likely going to come down the pike. And as we get older, there's a bigger likelihood of that. So one of the things that seems to be prolonging life, prolonging telomere length, prolonging immune robustness is intermittent fasting. Yet some of the recent research has dissed intermittent fasting. So I would love you to share some of the recent research that you debunked. You debunked the debunker.
Yes, right. There was. Okay, intermittent fasting, for our listening audience, is going on periodic, either very low bouts of low-calorie food intake or actual fasting. But another way you can do it is by doing like a 5-2 plan, eating normally 5 days a week, and then 2 days a week, maybe eating 500 or 700 calories. And that's one way to do it. Another is to do something called TRF, time-restricted feeding, which means you stop eating at 6, and then you don't eat till 10 or 11, and then there's a lot of hours where, in effect, you're fasting. So that's supposed to reboot your immune system, get your stem cells to help your body regenerate organs, and so on.
Can you have a cup of coffee with something in it? Does that break that fast?
I think a cup of coffee would be more like just some fluid intake. It's not caloric. It's not, one of the macronutrients like protein or carbohydrates or,
Well, a lot of people
not
are
a
doing
Starbucks.
Bulletproof coffee these days. They're doing,
Not a Starbucks. Okay. But anyway, so somebody wrote an article saying the timers, they did an animal experiment. And what they did is they alternated days where they gave the mice like the feedback, whatever they could eat, and mice are ravenous. And then other days they fasted them. And they found that it wasn't good. It wasn't helpful. It caused their lipids to go up. It caused free radical damage, whatever. It wasn't helpful, and they gained weight. But actually what I thought that was, first of all, rats. Okay, not exactly a perfect model for what's going to happen with people, because we've cured numerous diseases in rats, and we've struck out with humans and curing Alzheimer's and paralysis and whatever. But the point of that is that I think was an experiment that replicates yo-yo dieting. The erratic eating sets you up for problems with insulin. Okay, you fast and then you eat a tremendous smorgasbord of foods, and your body overproduces insulin, and you keep doing that in a yo-yo fashion, and you will gain weight and you will increase your insulin. So I don't think that although it grabbed the headlines, I mean, it's like, there's a theme in journalism these days is like, you thought you were doing something smart. You idiot, you're actually killing yourself. That's sort of the theme of many of these clickbait headlines. And, any phenomenon gets tired. And so it's kind of like dog bites man. Nah, that gets boring. Man bites dog. That's interesting. That's how you get the public's eyeballs.
So do you practice regular intermittent fasting in your life?
I do TRF, time-restricted fasting, but I got to say, I love to eat, and I hate deprivation, so I don't really do that. What I do these days is,
You're so tall and lean. I'm going to ask you in a few minutes what you eat, because I've been kind of interacting with you over the last 20 plus years, and you look exactly the same. So one of the things I wanted to touch on in the show when you're done with the thought that you have in your mind is what you do to keep being so healthy as you look and are.
I think some of it's genetic, I think, because although I've had some premature illness in my family, my grandfather, the one who wanted me to become a dentist on my mother's side, because the mitochondria come from mom's side, lived to 101. But one of the things I'm doing these days is I'm doing the Whole30 diet. I embarked on that a couple of years ago, and I thought I'd just do it for 30 days. It's a paleo diet, so there's no grains, and there's no alcohol, which was a bit of a stretch for me. There's no sugar, and we eliminate certain, shall we say, potentially modern foods, like dairy. Dairy being, it's a protein. It's not a sugary protein, but we try to replicate what human diets were, say, before the agricultural revolution. And very interesting things happened to me. My cravings for sugar and carbohydrates went down. I can go to parties these days and everybody's drinking, and I have, I can drink if I want, but I have no great interest in it. I went, I've just been cleaning out my closet because, I looked at some of my pants that I wore a couple of years ago, and there were a couple of sizes too big. And really, I don't think I was overweight at that time. but my body changed, and in a good way. And the reason I undertook it is out of sympathy for my patients that I put on a paleo diet for, serious health problems like rheumatoid arthritis or something like that. And I said, hey, you're kind of a hypocrite because you're eating, you have a lot more leeway than they are. And I said, let me try it and see what it's like. Plus, get to about 65 and you start having more aches and pains. And, I was having some issues with my training. And with the paleo diet, I really broke through. And I found it, it's constricting, but it's worth it. It really is worth it. Feeling good is worth the discipline that's required to undertake a diet like that.
Oh, I'm a hedonist. People say, what religion are you? I go, hedonism. And I love, people say, you're so lucky you love discipline. I go, no, I love feeling good. You hit the nail on the head. So what would be your typical breakfast, lunch, and dinner? What did you, for example, eat yesterday?
Eggs are a mainstay, but I might have some, natural sausage. I might have some uncured bacon. I took advantage of some, there's sort of vegetable roll-ups. They're made out of zucchini, and they sort of replicate, roll-ups are nice, convenient food. You can put, cold cuts into a roll-up, but it's bread. So instead of that, I'll use, as I had last night for dinner, I used zucchini roll-ups. They're flat.
You mean like a
wrap?
Like
yeah,
a
exactly,
wrap.
a wrap.
Okay.
And I put in some natural turkey and some tomatoes and some avocado, mayonnaise, and lettuce. And I just sat there while watching the Yankees, and that was a good thing. And sometimes I'll put some avocado in there. For lunch today, before talking to you, I had some grass-fed beef that I made into a tacoless tacos. I just have the beef, and not the wrap, which is you just eat it with a fork. I made it with tomatoes and I made it with peppers. For some people, those foods are problematic, but not for me. People with osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis sometimes do better to avoid the nightshades.
A lot of my patient population is I love eggs. It's one of my favorite foods, but it's a reactive food for some people, especially if you have issues. Celiac tendency or wheat sensitive people tend to react to onions and eggs and dairy. And it's so sad because it's such a perfect food. And I know a lot of these diets, the keto and the paleo diet, focus a lot on egg. But if you couldn't eat egg, what do you think that you would recommend as alternatives?
I'd probably cook more stuff at dinner and then have that as leftovers. I could easily have salmon for breakfast. That's sort of like a Japanese breakfast. I actually like soup for breakfast. Soup can be a good way of starting the day, and it's convenient because you don't want to spend a lot of time preparing breakfast. But if you have leftover soup, you make a big pot of it in a crock pot or something like that. A soup that has some protein, maybe it has some poultry in it, or fish chowder. That can be a great start to the day. And it's, got a lot of vegetables and it's got broth in it. We know the healing powers of broth. That's a good thing to have. A lot of that is in the Whole 30 books, a lot of information online. That's not the only approach to paleo that's out there, but I think it's one of the most structured approaches to paleo, and I recommend it.
Do you eat much fruit?
I eat a fair amount of fruit. But for some people, they don't tolerate much fruit because they're insulin resistant or they're susceptible to overweight. But I'm not, and I exercise a ton. And so I eat a fair amount of fruit. One of the ways to minimize the ups and downs of blood sugar that you get with fruit, and some people really have fluctuations. I just ran into this with my daughter who's pregnant. She has gestational diabetes, and she tests herself after having fruit, and her blood sugar goes to the roof, even with natural fruit. So I taught her to have fruit with coconut cream or coconut milk. And that acts as sort of a buffer. It mitigates the effect of the sugar because it's a fat, and it sort of time releases the sugar so that when she tests herself an hour and a half later, her blood sugar's, practically normal.
That's a great idea.
Maybe some nuts, some walnuts or something like that, those being healthy. And nuts are a mainstay of my diet too because they're kind of an ideal food.
One of my very, very favorite combinations that I was just going to say right before you said nuts is I love purple grapes with walnuts. I just find that at the end of the meal, have a little handful of purple grapes and walnuts. That combination, the taste is so divine. It's better than candy, mousse, whatever. But I also do have for my patients that need to go completely off carbs, I've developed these puddings and blends that are completely sugar-free and delicious. They taste like you're sinning. They're Dr. Berkson's to Die For chocolate mousse.
With
I have my macadamia
natural
nut
cocoa.
pudding.
Yeah, see, for me, this is a big stumbling block for me, is that chocolate. I really love chocolate, and chocolate's healthy, and I think it really helps my brain work better. But I had to get myself used to 95 proof coffee. Chocolate, which is a little bit of a reach for some people because it's not that sweet and it's just rather bitter. 100 proof chocolate, that's a bit of a bridge too far, even for me. And sometimes I have that with a little bit of decaf, but then you're getting all the antioxidants without any of the downside, without the sugar, the caloric load of chocolate. But chocolate also, I consider it medicinal. Along with decaf coffee, along with Swiss processed decaf coffee, I actually think it's medicinal. It's got full of antioxidants, and actually one of my new sponsors is a maker of a very high antioxidant coffee. We'll see how that works for our listeners.
How many sponsors do you have on your shows? It looks like your show is going really big guns.
I don't know, it was 6 or 8 sponsors. Some big ones and some minor ones. I'm really happy to have Kyolic aged garlic extract, which I think is a terrific product. We also have Claire Labs on board, which I'm sure you'll recognize is really one of the great manufacturers, and a few others. But one guy that I'll be talking to soon is the manufacturer of a. We'll have to find out how he vets it, but it is a high antioxidant coffee. And it's available in both decaf form, Swiss processed, natural, organic decaf, and high test caffeine coffee. And he's an expert on the, I'll give you his name because you may want to interview him. He's a really interesting guy. We now recognize the health benefits of coffee. I mean, I thought I guiltily consumed coffee for so many years and so, it's a vice. Turns out.
I never guiltily consumed it because I go to the Church of Hedonism.
Oh, okay.
There's 1,000 polyphenolic compounds that help you out, and it does open up the capillaries in your brain. But I have a question for you. Yeah. So many people have reflux. Yeah. And caffeine softens the lower esophageal sphincter. How do you give your guidelines to your patients who you don't want on acid blockers, proton pump inhibitors, but you want them to enjoy coffee, yet they're prone to reflux? This is a real question for so many of my patients.
Well, they can have some of these ersatz coffees that are not, the de-acidified coffees like kava. It's not the herb kava. Kava was the name of a type of bland coffee before there was herbal kava, which is the sedating herb. The other thing is that, frankly, if you go on a low-carb diet, often you alleviate your problems without having to eschew some of these classic things that are create ulcers and GERD.
That is so true. So many people really do get reflux from carbs and from gluten. But there was a double-blind randomized controlled trial showing that alginic acid, which is a seaweed compound, worked better than proton pump inhibitors. So in some of my patients who really have severe, let's say they have erosion, they've had so much reflux, they have ulcers now in their esophagus, or they have the esophagus, they're losing the protective layer, I'll just have them chew. There's a really great product called, I think the name of it is esophageal reflux is the name of the product.
It forms a sort of a raft on top of it. I don't use it that much, but it is a promising. I mean, mostly I use DGL. I use a product called Endofin, which is made by, I think it's made by Metagenics or Orthomolecular. I'm not sure, one of those companies. And, it in a way similar to the alginate, it coats the esophagus, and it has traditional things like marshmallow extract and cinnamon, which has a cooling effect.
Now, what's the name of that product?
Endofin, Endefen, and it's available. If you Google it, you'll find it.
Great. See, so there's all these natural answers. So instead of aging and worrying about coverage, the whole idea is embracing natural answers, but also living in a way that gives you less problems. I mean, I have to say, you look, I swear, because we're doing video here as well as audio, and it's really great because I got a room with a view. You look so fantastic. What do you do for your workout? Do you mind me asking you? Because you really do look
I
great.
kind of structure them around preparing for triathlons. And I don't do that many triathlons. Usually I try to work in 1 or 2 per season, but it gives me a training goal. And it's the Olympic distance triathlon, which is what you see in the Olympics, which is about a mile swim and a 24-mile bike ride, and followed by a 6-mile run, which each of those isn't all that much in and of itself. But if you put them together, it is kind of a 3-hour plus ordeal for me. So my goal is to keep doing it.
You do all of that in 3 hours?
Yeah, right, and change.
Wow.
And I'm slowing down. But I think just being out there is the thing. And it's more gratifying the older I get, just to be out there with those people, and most of them younger than me. And there's a dwindling cohort of us 60 plus folks doing that. I think the last race there was a guy who was 79 who did it, so that was pretty good. I aspire to be him. But so I run and I bike, and during the winter I can't go out. See, in New York you can't go cycling in January. Well, you can, but if you're very intrepid, but I'm not. So I do a lot of spin classes. And then I do a lot of swimming, because I live next to a Y, so I literally can swim several times a week in a pool. And then I also do yoga, which unfortunately I came to too late. I should have been doing yoga all along, but yoga really balances you out and helps with this, the stiffness that is engendered by all that pounding on the pavement. And I also do a day or two of strength training. I work that in because that helps to. When you're cycling, you really need strong legs. And when you swim, you need strong arm pulls. So you need to work on individual muscles.
It's funny because I kind of have an exercise routine that's not like yours, but it's robust.
And
like yours.
I'll return the compliment. You look amazing. You must be doing something extraordinary, because you look, I've known you for, I don't even want to say, but you're virtually unchanged.
But so you and I both do a lot of things to stay younger longer. We really do. And people come in and they're frustrated because they've taken up walking. And they're not getting great benefits, and walking isn't enough. It's just not enough. Or someone will say to me, "You don't have any fat or any skin hanging underneath your arms. As I wrote you on the email, what's the one exercise that you can do to avoid that?" But it's a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle and a lifetime commitment, unfortunately. And then I think some people just fall off the wagon, and at a certain age, it's just hard to get back on. And I'm very happy for the fact that I was motivated enough in midlife. I actually started relatively late, because I was not a jock in high school or college, but I started, in college, to realize that I was sitting around, smoking too many cigarettes and doing other grievous harm to my body, and I started working out, and I haven't looked back since. But I escaped the injuries that my, the high school football players experience. Some of them they've had their multiple joint replacements already. They had their glory days behind them, and now they're debilitated.
Well, one of the things I wanted you to talk about is that fit seniors, and studies now have really shown this, have muscle size and strength and immune system robustness of 30-year-olds if you do keep up this active level. But then, of course, you have to do it in a way where you don't get injured, because if people just dive into it without a cogent strategy, then you get injured and you just stop doing it. But would you talk about how fit seniors can stay equivalent to 30-year-olds if they keep up lifestyles like yours?
It appears, and this is, again, it's not like, okay, I hit my 65th birthday, I'm just going to just start running marathons. You really have to sort of initiate this in midlife. It's not too late ever to start. But fit seniors, in one recent study, who cycle a lot, and they cycle as much as 200 miles per week. So that's a lot of cycling. They have obviously better muscle function that's equivalent to that of a 30-year-old. But interesting, there's other offshoots to that. They have better immunity. They have better T cells. A thing or two about T cells is that T cells decline as you age. The thymus makes T cells. And in a very elderly person, it's very difficult to find. The cadaver that I dissected in medical school, we got a cadaver of a very frail 80-year-old woman, and we searched almost in vain for the thymus. We thought, let's find the seat of immunity in the body. And it was this very tiny sliver of tissue in the middle of her chest. In a baby, it actually occupies like a fist-size space within the chest. It's a very big organ because that's the time in life when we're generating immunity. As you age, it declines. But what they found is that in these exercisers, it did not decline.
You know, there was an article, I think it came out in Sports Medicine Physiology, and it was a few years ago, and they took what they called master athletes, and they were anywhere from age 40 to age 80, and they were people that exercised robustly an hour a day for at least 6 days a week, and they did MRIs of their thigh muscles and how much fat. And they were able to show that in 80-year-olds that were exercising robustly for 1 hour 6 days a week, they had the same thigh mass and strength as 40-year-olds. They just had a little bit more fat. Your body does lay down a little bit more fat, but they said the idea of inevitable frailty, if you choose to have a commitment to a certain lifestyle, doesn't have to be true.
It doesn't have to be true, but I think, well, let's be realistic. I think a part of this, I think the dark side of this health advocacy is that we can somehow tell people that they're immortal, that they'll fend off all misfortune, they'll live to be 120, and they'll be, a stud in bed and an ultra marathoner. And it's interesting when you watch the senior Olympics and you look at the 90 plus category and you see the guy who wins the 100-yard dash. It's an amazing feat, but he's really slow because things do slow down. So, we're chasing sometimes a bit of a chimera sort of a mirage if we think that just by virtuous acts we can fend off all misfortune. I think that we have to introduce an element of realism to our patients, because some of them, in a bad way, use all these healthy practices as a form of denial of the natural process of aging, and we have to accommodate ourselves to that. And, when our knees give out, we maybe have to cross train in a different way, or if our eyesight fails, we have to figure out a way to get information through audiobooks. There are workarounds, and survival is a constant a process of adaptation.
I think you're talking about resilience.
Yes, exactly.
Vitamin R, resilience. Exactly. And that's so important, and something today in the American society where we think we should get it and we can get it. And if we don't get it, we're really upset and we're going to sue somebody that we didn't get it. And I actually have this lovely, lovely patient, Ron, who was so upset. She thought that if she exercised and worked out well and maybe even took bioidentical hormones, she wouldn't have menopause. Why should she have menopause? Why can't you stop menopause? Why is it inevitable? And she didn't want to, and she's a lovely woman, but she's fighting the idea of aging. And the idea is you want to age as best as you can, but you also need to realize that there's stages of life that are hardwired biologically inside of us, and you don't want to be in denial and then go to the dark side from that.
Yeah, we just, I think, create unrealistic expectations in some ways. On the one hand, we want to make positive exhortations, but we also don't want that disconnect to happen where people say, oh my goodness, I can't understand what happened. I've been taking vitamins, I've been exercising, I've been eating a perfect diet. Oh, why do bad things happen to good people? That's an age-old question.
Well, so 24 years ago when I had breast cancer and I didn't know I was a DES daughter, and I'd been a yoga teacher for years, I'd been eating, I was into this for years, cleansing, forgiving people, all this. And I remember this doctor, I was so struck by, because people were saying, if this happens to you and you were living perfectly and cancer's a call to change, you should be eating a diet of bonbons. And this very intelligent oncologist that I had this long conversation with, because right at first I was struggling to grasp that this happened to me, he said, well, no one can guarantee anything, but you can guarantee that you move more elegantly through whatever shows
There
up.
You go. And that's, I think, encapsulates it. So it's, the fact that sometimes these things happen amidst our best efforts. It's not a repudiation of our lifestyles. It's just, it's just the reality that, things happen. We hopefully can surmount health challenges. Each health challenge is an adjustment and helps to inform our future choices, or else we move on to a different plane.
So you have your radio show, you have your blog, you're doing so many, of course, on my radar, it's come up more recently, but you say you've been doing it for a while. You're pumping out videos and articles, and you also see patients. Indeed. So how many patients do you see a week, and where do you see them? Do you have a home office?
No, I see patients at a regular office, but lately I've limited my practice. For about 30 plus years, as you mentioned earlier, I was seeing patients on a full-time basis, and now I see patients 2 days a week, which enables me to see, anywhere from, 15 to 20 patients a week. Which is great for the patients who've been seeing me forever. And then on a selective basis, I see a few new patients every month. But I find that that works for me because I really, as you do, I like a career that's balanced between being a clinician, because I think if you just talk about this stuff in the abstract, it's not grounded. It's like we want to see all these theoretical things, unless you see how the rubber meets the road when you apply them. It's all theory, and, you can look it up on Google, but that isn't necessarily going to give you the answers. So working with patients gives me, grounds me in reality. And then I can take that experience and then share it with people via the podcasts and the radio show and the writing, and now the videos.
So if people want to get a hold of your work, if they want to hear the great stuff you're doing, if they want to see you, what are the routes to get to you?
It's all there at drhoffman.com. We call the
Dr. Hoffman, Hoffman, drhoffman.com.
And you can subscribe to the newsletter, and you can subscribe to podcasts via that website.
How often does your newsletter come out?
It comes out every week. And I write it myself. It's really an anomaly.
Not too many people write their newsletter themselves, people. This is really true. And is there a charge for it?
No. It's free. It's absolutely a free resource. And
so you have a free weekly newsletter that you write yourself, and you've been in the field forever. You've been hosting guests forever. So this is just a wealth of information, and it's wonderful that we have a resource like this, Dr. Hoffman, and we get to know he's really in Manhattan because we heard the ambient sounds outside. This has been so exciting. Do you have any final caveat that you would like to say? I'm going to have you back on the show because there's so many other topics to talk about, but anything else that's burning?
No, the only thing I want to say is that we're really in the same business, and I can really sense the excitement that you still have after many years of doing this, of communicating the information, discovering new things, and imparting your knowledge to your audience. And so we're kindred spirits in that respect.
We really are. We both are just so in love and lucky and fortunate to have a career that we feel we're making a difference, and it never ends, and there's always more information. For example, just like the calcium story, or it's never ending, new information coming out to help people, and at the same time we get to really it's hard work, but it's a lot of fun. Just like the exercise, it's hard work, but it pays off to be a better hedonist and enjoy yourself inside yourself. Well, it's really wonderful. I wish that we lived closer so that I could invite you over for a carb-free meal and make something enticing for you. But thank you so much for spending time with my tribe, and I'm going to put in the show notes. I'll put your address there, and I hope to have you on the show again. It was wonderful seeing you look so fabulous.
Well, thank you. You do as well. I haven't seen you in a long time, but whatever you're doing agrees with you.
Okay, blessings, dear one. Bye, my friend. Bye.